Imagine an X-ray machine, but instead of scanning for broken bones, it scans for broken motives.
Oh, wow. That is a heavy thought right out of the gate.
Right. Because usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute precision. You fracture your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor points to it, says, there's the problem.
Yeah, it's very binary. It is clean. We like things to be visible and easily categorized.
We really do. But then you step into the world of human thoughts, hidden motives, the secrets of the heart, and suddenly that X-ray machine is, well, it's pretty much useless.
Because we are looking at a landscape that is murky, even to ourselves.
Yes. We try to hide our true intentions.
Yeah.
And not just from the public, but, even from those closest to us.
For sure.
Yet, what if there is an eye that sees through all our carefully constructed social barriers with zero friction? Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here for this one.
For this deep dive, we're examining Charles Spurgeon's massive commentary on Psalm 139. And this is sourced from his work, The Treasury of David.
It is such a phenomenal text to look into.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack the staggering attributes of God presented in this text. We are talking about his all-seeing eye, his everywhere presence, and his meticulous creation of human life.
And we really want to see how the knowledge of these attributes practically impacts the way you live, work, and think on a daily basis.
Yeah, so I want to ask you, the listener, a direct question to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this material. Why does the idea of being completely known by a creator, down to your unspoken thoughts and hidden anxieties, bring peace and security rather than terror to a believer?
That is the tension we are going to unravel today.
But before we get into the heavy theological implications of the text, there is this historical debate surrounding the authorship that our sources address right out of the gate.
Right, the Aramaic expressions debate.
Yeah, some modern critics claim King David did not actually write this text. They point to certain Aramaic expressions found in the Hebrew poetry.
And they argue that those linguistic markers mean the text belongs to a much later era, right? Like long after David was gone.
Precisely. That is a very common critical approach in textual studies, where scholars use loan words to date ancient documents.
But Spurgeon counters that methodology with a very sharp literary argument.
He does. What does he say about it?
Well, he argues that stripping David of authorship simply because of a few Aramaic expressions is, it's as absurd as claiming John Milton did not write Paradise Lost, just because Milton used specific archaic or highly unusual vocabulary choices.
That is a great analogy. You really have to consider the internal evidence, right? The style, the tone, the thematic matter.
Yeah, and Spurgeon points out that this composition bears the distinct image of King David so clearly that it could have come from no other mind.
The intense, agonizingly personal relationship with Jehovah, the soaring poetic structure, the theological weight, it all points directly to the man who wrote the majority of the Psalter.
Plus, we have to ask a logical question about ancient linguistics. Who knows how much of that antique speech might have been purposely retained among noble minds who, rejoiced in remembering the descent of their race.
Right. The critics often run to wild inferences based on a handful of words. But the internal evidence strongly supports David as the author, dedicating this piece to the chief musician for solemn corporate worship.
So with the authorship settled, the text opens with this massive statement, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me."
The concept of God searching a human being is central to everything that follows.
And when I hear the word search, I think of looking for misplaced car keys, which kind of implies a lack of knowledge.
Yeah, same here. But the sources note that the Hebrew root word used here carries a much more aggressive, exhaustive connotation.
It originally means digging for precious metals, mining deep into the earth, or searching a man for contraband goods.
Oh, the mining analogy is vital to understanding the text. Think about what ancient mining required. It was not a superficial scanning of the ground.
No, not at all. It involved breaking through hard rock, descending into dark shafts, and sifting through tons of dirt to find the hidden veins of silver or gold.
It implies a thorough, exhaustive investigation, ransacking every corner to see what is hidden in the dark.
And applied to God's omniscience, it means he does not just look at the surface presentation we offer to the world.
He breaks through the hardened exterior of our public personas and examines the actual ore of our character.
That makes me think of going through an intense security scan at an airport.
Oh, that is a good modern equivalent.
You have the metal detectors, the millimeter wave scanners, the pat-downs, But all of human searching requires friction. You have to take off your shoes, empty your pockets, stand in a specific posture.
Yeah, it's a hassle. But the terrifying and awe-inspiring thing about this divine search is that God does it effortlessly without needing to remove any physical barriers.
He does not need you to empty your pockets. He just sees right through the fabric of your existence.
And it goes so far beyond just a general character assessment. The text specifies that God knows our downsitting and uprising.
That is a level of minute tracking that, frankly, borders on the incomprehensible.
It really does. Every single time I sit down at my desk to type an email, every time I stand up to grab a cup of coffee, it is observed.
It is not just the big, monumental, life-altering decisions, like who you marry or what career you choose.
Right. It's the most casual, seemingly insignificant movements of your daily routine.
If we pull back and look at the connection between those physical movements and our internal state, we realize that action always follows meditation.
When the text links our downsitting and uprising, it is linking our rest and our activity.
Yeah, and one of the commentators in the source material brings in the historical context of Jacob's ladder from the book of Genesis.
I would love that connection.
In that narrative, Jacob saw angels ascending before they descended to service among mortals. The commentary uses this to illustrate that God watches our public activities, but he also pays equal attention to our rest.
Our isolation and our private contemplation, which are the very things that prepare us for those public activities.
Exactly. He knows the inward thoughts that regulate our physical movements.
Whether we sink in lowly self-renunciation or ascend in pride, the Most High sees the motions of the mind as clearly as the motions of the body.
He discriminates our action and our repose, marking what is good and what is evil, dividing the wheat from the chaff with an unerring eye.
So that transition from physical movement to the internal workings of the mind brings us to a part of the text that I find genuinely staggering.
The part about thoughts.
Yeah. The psalmist says, "Thou understandest my thought afar off." I want to pause and really chew on the mechanics of that statement.
It's a lot to process.
How can a creator understand a thought before I even think it? If the thought has not even formed in my own consciousness yet, if the neurons haven't fired to create that specific idea, how is it already comprehended by God?
That is the core of divine omniscience, distinguishing it completely from human anticipation.
Okay, break that down for us.
William Greenhill, one of the Puritan commentators cited in the material, provides an agricultural analogy to explain this mechanism.
I love a good agricultural analogy.
Think of a master gardener who has spent decades working a specific plot of land. That gardener knows precisely what weeds will spring up from specific sections of ground long before they ever break through the surface of the soil.
Because the gardener intimately knows the exact chemical composition of the soil and the specific seeds buried within it, right?
Spot on. Because he knows all that, he can anticipate the growth before it happens.
So, similarly, God knows the tendencies of our minds because he manufactured the soil. He made the human heart.
Yes. He knows our imaginations, our biases, and our natural inclinations before we even act upon them.
He understands the entire chain of our reasonings, the source, the drift, and the eventual result of a thought, even when that thought is completely invisible to our own self-awareness.
Taking that a step further, another commentator, Henry Ward Beecher, offers an imagery that completely changes how you view human interaction.
Oh, the beehive analogy.
Yeah. Beecher says that to each other, humans are opaque beehives. We see the bees going in and out of the hive.
Which represent our outward actions, our facial expressions, our spoken word.
Right, but we cannot tell what actual work they are doing inside the dark structure. But to God, you are a glass beehive.
A glass beehive. That is such a vivid picture.
He sees all the worker bees buzzing inside, constructing the honeycombs of your thoughts, your hidden motives, your silent anxieties, and your secret ambitions.
Nothing is opaque to him. Everything is entirely transparent, happening in broad daylight.
And that transparency inevitably extends from the mind to the mouth to our speech. The text states, "There is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether."
The imagery here is that the unformed word, which lies resting on the tongue before it is spoken, is like a seed resting in the soil.
God knows the nature of that seed completely before it ever blossoms into sound.
Even an unspoken word, like a sarcastic comment or an angry retort that you hold back by sheer willpower and silence, is thoroughly known and registered by the great searcher of hearts.
The intent is as loud as the vocalization. And because he knows us so exhaustively, from our physical steps to our unformed syllables, the text concludes that he surrounds us entirely.
The phrase, "Thou hast beset me behind and before," is used to describe this reality.
Beset is a heavy word. It sounds physical, almost claustrophobic.
It is a word loaded with tension. In ancient military terms, to be beset resembles a city besieged by an invading army, hemmed in on all sides with siege ramps and troops, leaving absolutely no escape route.
Alternatively, it is likened to a prisoner being marched along by a heavily armed guard, physically gripped by an officer of the law.
We cannot turn back and outrun this presence, because he is behind us, meticulously recording our past.
And we cannot go forward and outmarch him, because he is already before us, completely foreknowing our future.
But the sources clarified that for the believer, this reality of being beset or surrounded does not feel like being a prisoner of war. It is not a hostile siege.
The imagery shifts to something much more intimate. It is described as a father folding his arms around his child.
The hand that is laid upon the psalmist is not the heavy hand of an arresting officer. It is a hand laid upon us to rule us, to lead us, to protect us from external threats, and to restore us when we stumble.
What Spurgeon is arguing here is that this omnipresence acts as a two-edged sword, depending entirely on the reader's state of mind.
It is a terrifying, suffocating thought for a criminal trying to run from justice, but it provides the ultimate safety and perimeter defense for a child of God.
Which logically forces the human mind to ask a question about geography and spatial reality.
Because if someone is tracking your steps, your thoughts, and your unspoken words that closely, the instinctual human reaction, especially if there's any guilt present, is to run.
Yeah, you want to find a blind spot in the surveillance.
Right, and that is precisely the rhetorical question the psalmist raises. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence?
It is the universal human impulse to hide, dating all the way back to the narrative of Eden.
The text sets forth the absolute reality of omnipresence to crush that impulse. A heathen philosopher once famously asked a Christian, "Where is God?" in an attempt to mock the invisible nature of the deity.
And the Christian simply replied, "Where is he not? You cannot elude the vigilance of the Almighty."
The commentators point out that it is not necessarily that David wished to avoid the great invisible spirit. Rather, he is using poetry to emphasize the sheer physical impossibility of flight.
We must be, whether we will it or not, as near to God as our soul is to our body. His mind is in our mind, himself within ourselves.
There is no external location you can travel to where you are outside the jurisdiction of his presence.
So David explores the absolute extremes of the known universe to prove this point. He talks about vertical extremes first, ascending into heaven or making his bed in hell.
Now, when he uses the word hell here, the sources clarify he means Sheol or Hades, the abodes of the dead, the lowest imaginable depths of existence.
I have to push back on this concept, though. Practically speaking, is it not terrifying to think of God being present in the darkest possible realms?
We usually associate God's presence exclusively with light, joy, singing, and peace.
Yeah, the idea of the Creator being actively present in Hades seems chilling and almost contradictory to his nature.
It is a sobering concept that requires us to distinguish between God's essential presence and his manifest attributes.
Okay, what does that mean in practical terms?
We have to understand that God is the one great existence everywhere. In theological terms, he is a simple spirit, meaning he is without physical dimensions or divisible parts.
Because he has no physical boundaries, he is fully present in his entire being at all times in all places.
Exactly. His essential presence does not fluctuate or dilute depending on the location. However, the effects or the manifestations of his presence differ vastly depending on the realm he is inhabiting.
Ah, I see. So in heaven, his presence is manifested through absolute bliss, radiant glory, and unending joy.
But in the realm of darkness or judgment, his presence is the manifestation of his strict justice, his holiness, and his terror against rebellion.
The physical or spiritual environment does not change God. Rather, God defines the experience of the environment by how he chooses to display his attributes there.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. The manifestation changes based on the audience, not the presence itself.
After looking at the vertical extremes of heaven and hell, David moves to horizontal extremes.
He brings in this gorgeous, sweeping poetry about taking the wings of the morning and dwelling in the uttermost parts of the sea.
It is an ancient metaphor for the astonishing velocity of light.
The idea is that if you could somehow graft the sunbeams onto your own shoulders and fly with the speed of the dawn across the oceans, past the horizon to some remote, solitary, uncharted rock, God is already waiting for you there.
James Neal, an observer of Middle Eastern geography cited in the text, makes a very specific observation regarding that exact imagery of the wings of the morning.
What does he point out?
He points out that in the landscape of Palestine, brilliant white morning clouds appear just before sunrise. They hang low in the valleys and wrap around the limestone hills, looking almost like massive pale wings.
But as soon as the sun crests the horizon, the intense eastern heat dissipates them, and they vanish incredibly quickly.
Right, so to the vivid, observant imagination of the ancient Near East, those swift, fleeting clouds represent the speed of the dawn.
But the theological point is that even if you could fly at that speed, outdistancing the clouds to an unknown ocean, the active energy of God is wrapping around you still.
Yeah. The text says, "Even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me." Both the hands of God are with his servants to sustain them in the most isolated places and against rebels to overthrow them.
John Trapp, a classic commentator, provides an analogy for this futility of escape that I find unforgettable.
The fish on the hook analogy?
Yeah, he says trying to escape God is like a fish swimming to the end of its line with a hook already set firmly in its mouth.
You might feel the rush of the water over your gills. You might feel like you are swimming freely through the vast open ocean, putting miles between you and the boat.
But the reality is you are tethered. Your freedom is an illusion. There is no actual autonomy from the Creator's sovereignty.
So if distance cannot hide you, what about darkness? Thieves, assassins, and hypocrites have historically always preferred the midnight hours.
But the psalmist argues that darkness hides absolutely nothing from God.
The foolishness of trying to hide in the dark is rooted in a severely flawed anthropomorphic view of God. People project their own physical limitations onto the divine.
We think he relies on the reflection of physical photons to see, just as our retinas do.
But God created the photons. He created the very concept of light. He is not dependent on his own creation to perceive reality.
Edward Hitchcock, a scientist and theologian referenced in the commentary, offers a highly compelling speculation on this idea.
He suggests that the sable knight is an unerring photographer.
Hitchcock argues that chemistry and the laws of nature actually imprint our actions on the physical universe itself.
This means that every dark deed, every secret crime committed under the shroud of midnight is permanently recorded by the environment and will eventually be drawn into the daylight of justice.
The physical universe acts as a faithful, silent witness and record of our actions. To the omniscient one, the night literally shines as the day. Darkness and light are both alike to him.
The idea that the very atmosphere or the chemical makeup of a room records our deeds is a heavy reality to sit with.
It really is. But if this inescapable, all-encompassing presence is not just an external reality tracking you across oceans or through the dark, the text shifts to show that it reaches backward in time as well.
It goes back before you ever had the capacity to run or hide. It reaches into the very secret origins of your physical body.
The psalmist says, "For thou hast possessed my reins." This phrasing sounds archaic to modern ears. The reins are the kidneys, correct? Why is the text focusing on the kidneys?
In ancient Hebrew anatomical thought, the reins, or the kidneys, were considered the absolute center of the human emotional system.
Oh, okay.
Where we might use the word heart or brain today to describe the seat of desires, longings, and the innermost nature, the ancients used the kidneys.
So when David says God possesses his reins, he is acknowledging a deep ownership. God is the owner and landlord of his most secret, vulnerable self.
God does not just inspect us as an outside observer hovering around us. He is intimately at home within our biology.
He claims absolute ownership over the deepest parts of our emotional and physical architecture because he is the one who constructed it.
The text then uses this incredible imagery of a master craftsman working in the dark. It describes the formation of biological life in the womb.
The psalmist says God covers us there, knitting us together. The commentators liken it to an artisan working in a pitch-black cave without a single candle, yet producing the most perfect, intricate, self-sustaining mechanism imaginable.
There is a specific historical analogy used here about a workman that I want to unpack because the language is quite dense.
Yeah, the commentary compares this biological formation to a Phrygian workman and the sacerdotal habit. Can you translate those terms for us?
Certainly. Phrygia was an ancient kingdom known for producing the most highly skilled craftsmen and needleworkers in the ancient world. Their embroidery was legendary for its intricate detail and beauty.
Okay, and what about the sacerdotal habit?
When the commentary mentions the sacerdotal habit, sacerdotal simply means priestly. It is referring to the highly elaborate sacred garments worn by the high priest in the tabernacle.
as well as the intricately woven, multicolored veils that separated the holy places within the sanctuary.
Right. So the metaphor suggests that the physical creation of the human body, the routing of the veins, the elasticity of the arteries, the tensile strength of the muscle fibers, and the delicacy of the membranes is comparable to, but infinitely surpasses, the highly skilled sacred art used for those priestly garments.
A great human artist will often lock himself in his studio, laboring alone in the dark, and will not suffer his work to be seen by the public until it is completely finished.
Even so, the Lord fashions the human frame in the dark, silent studio of the womb, where no human eye beholds the process, and the veil of nature is not lifted until every biological system is complete and functioning.
Looking at that biological masterpiece, David responds by saying, I am fearfully and wonderfully made.
I have a question about that specific pairing of words.
Good.
Wonderfully makes total sense. The human body is a marvel of biology, chemistry, and design. But why should looking at our own biology make us use the word fearfully?
That is a very fair point.
Should we not just say we are wonderfully made, celebrate the design, and leave the concept of fear out of it?
Well, Andrew Fuller, a theologian who thought very intently about the intersection of human nature and divine might, provides a perspective on this that is incredibly enlightening.
What does Fuller say?
He explains that the human frame is so delicate, so fragile, and so reliant on thousands of microscopic variables functioning perfectly at the same time, that the more we understand our own biology, the more we tremble at our own continued existence.
Wow, that is a really sobering way to look at it.
We live moment by inhalation, drawing air into our lungs, yet diseases, airborne pathogens, and death are conveyed by that very same air we must breathe to survive.
A single morsel of food we eat to nourish ourselves could contain a deadly toxin. A slight bump to the delicate column of the spine can instantly deprive us of all physical sensation and movement.
Exactly. The rapid circulation of the blood, which gives us life and energy, can also diffuse deadly substances or infections throughout the entire frame in a matter of minutes. Our physical existence hangs by an incredibly thin thread.
When we look at how easily this intricate machine can be broken, disrupted, or destroyed, we are filled with awe, but also a very healthy, sobering fear of the God who sustains it every single second.
We take our health and our basic bodily functions for granted every day, but the reality is we are walking miracles of divine preservation.
And this intricate design was not improvised. It was planned out long before it existed.
The commentary discusses the idea of God's book, where all our bodily members were written before they even came into being.
This points directly to the theological concepts of divine foreknowledge and predestination.
The text uses an architectural analogy to explain this. An architect does not just show up to an empty dirt lot and start blindly hammering nails.
Right, an architect draws detailed plans, creates precise blueprints, and writes exact specifications for every beam and window in a book long before a single brick is laid.
That architectural analogy perfectly captures the concept the psalmist is communicating. The great maker of our frame wrote down all the specifications of our members in the book of his eternal purposes.
The fact that we have eyes to see, ears to hear, hands to work, and feet to walk is entirely due to the wise and gracious decree of heaven.
He saw our physical substance when it was yet unperfect meaning, when it was just an unformed mass, a microscopic ball of life yet to be unwound into a complex organism.
And the commentators draw a massive, sweeping theological connection from this physical reality to a spiritual reality.
Just as the physical body of a human being is fashioned in secret, in the dark, before it sees the light of day, the mystical body of Christ, which is the global church, is currently being fashioned in secret throughout history.
I love that parallel. The idea is that the elect, those who belong to Christ, are being gathered, shaped, and fitted together invisibly over centuries.
We see the individual parts, but God is looking at the blueprint of the whole structure.
Precisely. The great Lord knows precisely who belong to Christ. His omniscient eye perceives the chosen members who shall yet be made one with the living person of the mystical Christ.
Those who are currently living in rebellion, those who are as yet unborn, or those who are unrenewed, are nevertheless written in the Lord's book of life.
The commentary uses the creation of the first woman as a type or shadow of this.
Just as Eve was formed from Adam's side in silence, secrecy, and deep sleep, the bride of Christ is currently being fashioned in the timeline of human history to eventually be displayed in absolute glory at the end of the age.
Recognizing that the Creator intricately designed your physical frame and planned your existence naturally shifts your focus.
You move from looking downward at your physical biology to looking upward, contemplating his continuous thoughts about you.
David marvels at the sheer volume of God's thoughts toward a believer, stating that they are more numerous than the grains of sand.
The sources mention ancient writers like Pindar and Lucan, who wrote epic poetry and frequently used the impossible task of measuring the ocean's sand as a boast of magnitude.
Yeah, the sheer mathematical volume of God's thoughts toward a single individual is staggering to contemplate.
The task of counting God's thoughts of love, providence, and care would be a never-ending exercise, far surpassing any human computational ability.
Pindar and Lucan use the sand on the seashore as the ultimate metric for the uncountable, the infinite. David adopts this familiar cultural metric to say that God thinks upon us infinitely.
Thoughts of pardon for our daily sins, renewal of our energy, upholding us in temptation, supplying our physical and spiritual needs, educating our ignorance, and perfecting our character perpetually well up in the mind of the Most High.
It is a stark, comforting contrast to the idea of a cold, mechanical universe governed only by impersonal laws of physics. We have a highly personal creator whose detailed attention is constantly focused on our welfare.
And the practical, daily response to this reality is beautiful. David says, "When I wake, I am still with thee."
Thomas Case, another commentator, has a great piece of practical advice regarding this phrase.
What does he say?
He meets that the saints leave their hearts with God overnight, so they find them with him in the morning.
It's like winding up a mechanical watch at night before you go to sleep and finding it still ticking rhythmically the next day.
You season your mind with thoughts of God before sleep, perhaps through prayer or reading. And when your consciousness returns in the morning, your heart is already back at his palace gates.
That continuous, unbroken communion is the hallmark of a vibrant, healthy spiritual life. The thoughts of God were the very first visitors David entertained in the morning.
Before the anxieties of the day, the demands of the kingdom, or the threats of his enemies can break into his mind, his soul is already anchored in the divine presence.
However, this intense, peaceful intimacy with God leads directly into an abrupt shift in the text that often startles readers who are not expecting it.
That shift gives me theological whiplash every time I read it.
Same here. The psalmist goes from these beautiful, warm, comforting thoughts of God's presence, his precious thoughts, and waking up in his arms, straight into a declaration of war.
Surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men.
We go from a serene, peaceful meditation on biology and grace to calling out violent men. Why this harsh, sudden shift in tone?
It is a jarring transition to modern ears that are accustomed to separating theology from justice, but it is entirely logical within the framework of the ancient mind and the reality of the psalm.
An acute, overwhelming awareness of God's absolute holiness naturally creates a total intolerance for cruelty, blasphemy, and violent rebellion. The two cannot coexist.
When a person draws near to God and truly understands his purity and his love for human flourishing, they cannot help but be revolted by actions and people who defy him and destroy others.
David is essentially saying, if God, in his perfect justice, will not let you live with him eternally because of your wickedness, I will not have you live with me or influence my court now.
God gave these men their tongues, their intellect, and their very breath, and they used those exact gifts to turn against their benefactor out of sheer malice.
The text specifically mentions these men taking God's name in vain as evidence of their wickedness. Lancelot Andrewes, an English bishop and scholar, provides a very helpful philosophical breakdown of human action to explain what this means.
Right, he says every human action consists of three parts: the end goal, the agent doing the action, and the work itself.
He explains that taking God's name without a right end goal like aiming for his glory, the public good, or the establishment of truth, is taking it in vain.
It is like a farmer sowing expensive seed into the dirt without any intention of ever reaping fruit. It is a wasteful, insulting use of something sacred.
But David goes even further in his reaction to this. He says, I hate them with perfect hatred. Now, I have to challenge this concept based on the wider teachings of Scripture.
Okay, let's hear it.
How can a Christian, who is explicitly commanded to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them, boast about hating someone with perfect hatred? Is that not a blatant contradiction?
It is a paradox that requires very careful philosophical distinction, and Augustine of Hippo provides the classic resolution for this tension.
Augustine explains that perfect hatred means hating the sin, but loving the individual.
You passionately hate the fact that they are wicked, that they cause pain, and that they rebel against truth, but you fiercely love the fact that they are human beings, originally created in the image of God.
To hate a man simply for his own sake, out of petty spite, or as revenge for a personal injury is a moral crime.
But to loathe the rebellion, the blasphemy, and the systemic cruelty that destroys human flourishing and insults the Creator is a virtue.
Perfect hatred does not occupy a passive neutral position. It is wholehearted, burning indignation against evil, while simultaneously maintaining the capacity to pray for the person's redemption and change of heart.
So practically speaking, it is a righteous indignation against the disease of sin, not a malicious desire to destroy the patient suffering from the disease.
That makes a lot of sense. But it is very easy to point fingers at external wickedness. It is easy to look at the bloody men, the corrupt politicians, or the violent criminals and say, I hate what they do, look how terrible they are.
True godliness, however, demands that you take that intense scrutiny and turn it completely inward. You cannot just audit your neighbor's behavior. You have to audit yourself.
The text moves from judging external enemies to inviting an internal investigation. This is the practical climax and the logical conclusion of the entire psalm.
After establishing God's omniscience, his inescapable omnipresence, his creative rights as the maker of the body, and his justice against evil, David offers an incredibly courageous prayer.
Search me, O God, and know my heart. He voluntarily invites the very scrutiny he described in the opening verses of the poem.
I noticed a logical puzzle in the text here that caught my attention. David started verse 1 by saying, O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me.
He states it in the past tense as an accomplished, undeniable fact.
But here at the very end of the text, he is asking God to do it again in the present imperative. Search me, O God. Why is he asking God to do something he has already done?
Joseph Carroll, a 17th century clergyman, provides a very sharp insight into this apparent repetition.
David had already searched himself. He had examined his own conscience, reviewed his own actions, and found no willful, high-handed rebellion or secret alliance with the violent men he just condemned.
However, David was wise enough to know that human self-perception is deeply flawed. He knew that sin has a deceptive, narcotic quality that hides our true deformities from our own eyes.
We rationalize our own bad behavior while condemning the exact same behavior in others.
Therefore, David wanted the infinitely clearer, completely objective sight of God to expose any hidden flaws, biases, or corrupt motives he might have missed in his own self-evaluation.
He is essentially saying, Lord, my own internal audit shows I am clean, but I know I cannot fully trust my own ledger. Run your divine audit on my soul because your standard is the only one that matters.
That requires such immense courage and vulnerability. The sources use the analogy of pure gold being tested to illustrate this mindset.
Heavy, pure gold fears neither the furnace, the intense heat of the fire, the chemical test, nor the touchstone.
He that is true weight will be true weight, no matter how many times or how vigorously he is weighed on the scales.
David is willing to be put into the crucible of a divine examination because he actively wants the dross, the impurities, burned away. He wants to be totally authentic before his maker.
Authenticity is the direct opposite of hypocrisy, and Joseph Addison, the essayist, offers a severe warning about the dangers of self-deceit in this context.
He notes that the worst, most destructive kind of hypocrisy is not deceiving the world by putting on a fake, outward face of religious sanctity while living a secret life of sin.
While that is bad, the most fatal hypocrisy is actually imposing on yourself.
Mistaking your own vices for virtues, rationalizing your cruelty as justice or your greed as prudence, and remaining entirely blind to your own internal corruption.
That is why David's concluding prayer is so vital for spiritual health. He says, "See if there be any wicked way in me." By actively inviting God's searchlight into the darkest corners of his psyche, he is fighting against his own natural capacity for self-deception.
And the ultimate goal of this terrifying search is not just exposure or condemnation, it is correction. He prays, and lead me in the way everlasting.
The commentary contrasts the wicked way, which inevitably leads to pain, grief, and destruction, with the way everlasting, which is the ancient, time-tested path of faith, obedience, and godliness that has no end.
When you go to a doctor, you do not just want the MRI to show you the tumor. You want the cure. You want the divine physician to lead you out of the sickness, cut out the disease, and guide you into lasting health.
That is the precise reality of a renewed nature. An unconverted person, someone who loves their rebellion, hides from the light.
They do everything possible to avoid the searching eye of God, distracting themselves with noise, ambition, or pleasure because they love their sin and fiercely fear the exposure.
But a believer, even knowing full well that they are flawed and will be found lacking, invites the divine physician in. They want the spiritual disease healed more than they want their fragile pride protected.
This specific prayer proves that a massive internal shift has taken place in the individual. The soul now actively takes part with a reconciled God against its own hated sins, rather than taking part with its sins against a dreaded God.
Taking part with God against your own sin. That is an incredibly clarifying distinction that changes how you view the entire process of conviction.
It really does.
So, to bring all these massive concepts together for our deep dive today, we have traced a breathtaking theological progression through this ancient text.
We started by understanding God's vast microscopic knowledge of our every movement, our unspoken words, and our unformed thoughts.
We moved from there to the realization of his inescapable presence, reaching from the highest heights of heaven to the darkest, lowest depths of human existence.
We marveled at his secret craftsmanship, acting as the master artisan knitting our delicate biological frames together in the dark studio of the womb.
That realization of his holiness and care naturally fuels a fierce, perfect rejection of cruelty and wickedness in the world around us.
And most crucially, it culminates in a humble, courageous invitation for God to turn that intense searchlight onto our own hearts, expose our self-deceit, and lead us onto the path of everlasting life.
It truly is a complete, robust theological system contained within a single ancient poem.
It moves seamlessly from the loftiest, most abstract attributes of the Creator omniscience and omnipresence to the most intimate, practical application for the created human being.
It proves that high theology is not just for academic debate. It is intensely practical. A true knowledge of God inevitably leads to a true, unvarnished knowledge of oneself.
Absolutely.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought drawn directly from the speculations of our sources today.
The one about the physical atmosphere.
Yeah. The commentary suggested the fascinating idea that every unspoken word, every hidden act, and every secret motive might be permanently registered in the physical atmosphere and chemistry of the universe around us, like an unerring photograph taken in the dark that will one day be developed in the light.
If the physical universe itself retains the imprint of your most secret moments, and the creator of that universe reads your thoughts from afar off before they are even fully formed in your own consciousness.
How does that reality shape the very next thought you choose to entertain when this audio stops playing?
That is the crucible we all have to walk through.
Think about it. Thanks for joining us on Reformed Thinking.